Hello, friends. Welcome to episode 7 of Courage to Thrive, Reverend Dr. Robert Flanagan's podcast and video show, where he gets down to the nitty gritty of the deepest issues that affect humanity, which I just so much appreciate. I'm Hope Katz-Gibbs, proud producer of the show on Incandescent Radio and Incandescent TV. And we're also out there on Spotify, iHeart, and Apple with Courage to Thrive. You are going to be touched deeply by this conversation today. Episode 7 is our May 2026 episode, and it is Mental Health Awareness Month. So we're going to take a deep dive into suicide prevention with our guest, Dr. Christine Yu Moutier. She knows the impact of suicide firsthand. While in medical training in her career at the University of California, San Diego, she experienced a series of tragic losses, igniting a passion to learn more about what science can tell us about suicide risk and prevention, how suicide affects communities, and the role individuals, family members, colleagues, and the community leaders can play in reducing the risk. She today is the medical officer of the American Foundation of Suicide Prevention, and I am really looking forward to hearing this conversation. So take it away, Bob.
Thanks, Hope. As always, thanks for all the work that you do behind the scenes, making this podcast into what it is and how good it is. So I really appreciate all your help with that. And so, welcome, Christine. It's lovely to have you. It's been as we commented right before we came on, it's been a while since you and I have seen each other, and I'm so happy to have this time with you and to be able to speak with you on this topic and coming out. I think suicide prevention, suicide crisis ideation is so tied in with mental health. So I think it was that reason that I said let's do this in May. I know we have September's Suicide Prevention Month, so and we really could pick this up at any time. So I'm happy to have you on, and I think we'll start out with this will be less about kind of your just kind of walking through your resume, but more about just who you are and what you've done and what really brings passion into your life and what kind of your spiritual journey, if you will. So I think we should start out with just kind of this sense of, as I like to do, really say you were in high school, as a high school student, and what took you from, what you were doing in high school to college, medical school, and then as Hope mentioned in your bio, the passion for working directly to help prevent suicide prevention.
Yeah, thank you so much. What a kind of a treat in a way and a privilege to be able to talk so personally and share about why I do what I do and how it came to be. I do think that even as a psychiatrist, most people, including psychiatrists, don't devote their entire life's work to suicide prevention and loss and healing. So it is something that I certainly have reflected on. And, Bob, I think back to our own, when we were first getting to know each other in the world of AFSP and your advocacy and your own journey of, really identifying what was happening with mental health and in your own life, and then integrating that into your work. And I think it's a very similar thing for me that started, if I'm really thinking about it, and you brought up high school, so thank you for that. So I grew up I'm half Chinese. I grew up in a more Asian dominant household that is relevant to my mental health journey. Every aspect of our identity, including, racial, ethnic, geographical, gender, sex, spiritual, religious, I think it's all actually relevant. I see mental health as being integral and integrating with all of those aspects of who we are. So anyway, I bring up that cultural heritage with my Asian background because I grew up in a home environment that really caused me to internalize a belief system that, of course, was invisible to me because you grow up with it. You don't really recognize it as different as such, but that you earn the right to be in existence, to taking up space on the planet, to breathing air by achieving. And, in my family, it was a combination of a lot of, as I really look back on it with more, grace and time, there was a lot of laughter and humor and fun, but also very clear messages that just being your best, kind of fulfilling your true potential. No, that's not what it was about. It was about being the best. And if that went awry at any point in time, earlier than high school, but in high school as well, then, it was just sort of met with an affront to my father. And so anyway, all of this is going on invisibly. What it meant for me is that by the time I went to college, all of that was still working for me, because when when you know how to do academics as a kid, it all can be very consistent, and you just feel like your life is on a track that overall you can't really see this very fragile belief system that's holding it all together, because it hasn't had to be confronted yet. That confrontation for me happened during medical school. And by that point in time, through high school, through college, and into medical school, I hadn't really learned how to accept or acknowledge or even feel negative feelings and emotions. I know that sounds maybe really kind of harsh or wild, but anxiety, sadness, no space for that. Moving too fast, got too much to do. And I think what then happened in med school is my anxiety about not being the best anymore all the time came, which is so cliche, but it came into conflict with a sense of security and basic safety. And am I in the right place? I began to have constant fears about that failure was just around the corner, because I didn't know how to live in a space where the bell curve, where you're just living throughout, high end, middle, sometimes lower end, and all of it was sort of petrifying. And that anxiety didn't have a way to be expressed. And so what happened for me, maybe genetics, maybe other things, because mental illness is multifaceted. But I developed a full-blown eating disorder that was kind of a secret experience for a couple of years. And it was getting to the point that I think in a current eating disorder specialty environment, it would be viewed as life-threatening from a physical health standpoint, let alone the mental health aspects. In terms of my own view of myself was not coping well. And when I finally reached a point of crisis and needed to take time off from med school, which felt like a massive crisis in itself, because I'd only known a way to exist, which was just kind of moving forward and, achieving, like I said. So I did have suicidal crises during that, especially early part of that year off, where I had been both relieved to leave an environment that had set up all of this experience of suffering and angst and feeling different and unfit. Anyway, it led to getting help for the first time. And that therapy was, I view it as an ordained, God-given, otherwise coincidence, that I would meet through I had recently gotten married. We had this very funny, traditional idea that he needed to stop school and start working. And anyway, so he was working for Snap-on Tools, and through his EAP, I got introduced to a therapist at the local JCC, Jewish Community Center, where I could pay $10 a session as a student. And that older social worker, I think it's okay to say who she was. Her name was Donna Salk, and she was the ex-wife of Jonas Salk by chance, because it was La Jolla and the, institutes that went on there. Anyway, it was a life-changing transformational experience where I feel like not only did the eating disorder symptoms melt away, which felt like a miracle to me, because I thought we would have to deal with it head on, with education about nutrition and behavior patterns. And that's not what we dealt with. What we dealt with was all of that internalized, rigid, high, impossible expectation and perfectionism, and really the relationship with my family, and as it stood inside my own heart and mind. And so anyway, that was transformational. I went back to med school. I thought that I would live with an eating disorder lifelong, because so often they tend to be very chronic and recalcitrant. But I was very lucky and blessed that therapy largely healed that, which may have been an expression of more underlying issues and anxiety that started to be dealt with for the first time. So anyway, I'm going about my business back in med school. I find psychiatry. I love the field. I love the brain, the way that symptoms express. Obviously, I'd had my own experience by then. But the fact that you could actually help people was remarkable to me. So fast forward, though, I'm kind of hiding this whole lived experience thing that I'd gone through. But I'm back in this very perfectionistic, in a way, toxic academic medical environment. But I think as I was becoming healthier myself, that sense of authenticity, that while I wasn't talking openly about everything that I'd been through, I think people give off signals in small, informal ways. And I started hearing the stories of suffering and what my colleagues were going through in a way that in itself was a point of connection. It was so powerful to realize that all humans, even these top performing people who look on the surface like they have it all together, all have their own sort of cross to bear in terms of different challenges and suffering, whether it's mental health or other things. And then just to speed up my story a little bit, there were a series of suicide deaths. And the first one that I experienced was a medical student I worked with during my second year of residency. And we had worked closely together enough that we had done even some social things with groups of residents and students. And he took his life at the beginning of his senior year of med school. And it was like a truck hit me in terms of just the level of shock. And even though he wasn't, in my family or inner circle of friends, it affected me very, very much. I actually experienced some numbness and depersonalization for a few days, kind of observing myself clinically, wondering, is this going to resolve, or am I going to have to do something about this state of kind of shock and loss? That was, again, the first loss. That then the others were not as personally close to me, but in my university and health system environment, there were a total of 13 deaths by suicide over a period of 10 years. And by then, fast forward, I had become a dean in the medical school. And my passion for lived experience, changing the culture around mental health and the stigma around suicide and struggles was very, very deeply driving my decisions, albeit somewhat quietly. But then I did start telling my own story. Actually, like the first week I became a dean, the students were asking for, who am I? And I had to make a decision. Am I going to keep it a secret, or am I going to come right out in some way that could fit in the environment? And I ran it by my boss, what I had written out, because I wasn't sure if it would be safe for my job to even do that. And she was very supportive, and that really started my journey. And I found AFSP because later on, the leadership that I worked with at the med school and at the hospital system decided to, in their words, what the big D Dean said to me, get to the bottom of this. How many people have died? What is going on is suicide a purely individual matter, or does the environment that one works in and lives in and learns in, does it have anything to show up in terms of suicide prevention? And that, I think these days we understand that suicide can be a public health matter and can be approached. But at that time, I didn't have that knowledge. And I think the scientific field of suicide prevention was, even just, this is 25 years ago, I think it was at an earlier stage of, that was a legitimate question to ask. And AFSP had some resources, an interactive screening program, and that was the start of my becoming a volunteer for AFSP while I was still in academic medicine. So that's a little bit about kind of who I am and why this is a very deep passion for me. It's filled with hope because there's so much work that we all can do, but also can be invested at the national level. And that's the work of AFSP, really approaching this as a population health and a national public health crisis. And I think we've seen, you and I both, how our lives change when we just get to do something about something we care so passionately about, when we're able to share our stories, listen to others, be supportive to others. It's healing to help others too. So yes, I feel very blessed and privileged, even while kind of the mantle of responsibility is something I take very, very seriously. It's been, feels like, it does sometimes feel like, if you believe in God, or if you believe in, whatever that theology or world system is that you believe in, that I've been fortunate enough to have a path that was almost like I'm being led on. My decision to work for AFSP, for example, very much felt like that. And my husband and I both said to each other, like, our prayer at the time was, God, you better shut the door on this because it's happening.
Right.
It's a conveyor belt that's in motion. Yeah. So how fascinating is that, when of course we have agency and we could make a decision, but yet that is how it felt to us.
That's beautiful. Thank you for sharing all of that. That's I was reflecting how much that how similar in some ways, right? I came out of a different family circumstance with lots of abuse, both within and without, in my home, and not really understanding how to deal with that and how to place that, and then this sense of a bit of what you talked about of how do we engage emotionally, or how do we tap into our own sense of emotions, and how do we connect with that? And I think, some of it is maybe, kind of male driven, not wanting to do it, or not being able to do it. But also I think, cultural, a part of that is it's just best to put aside certain emotions because it's just not helpful in that moment as a young person to have these emotions. They're not being cared for, not being met. And so, I put those aside and then, for a good portion of my life, but then wound up at seminary and, came to a place was things were starting, those emotions were starting to, if I could say that either the place was safe, or it was just time that I had to kind of engage with those feelings that I just had set aside, and learning how to handle them. And at first it was, it wasn't, I didn't handle it well, and found that the only solution that I could think of in that moment of crisis was to end my life. And yet there was part of me that was saying this I'm not going to do this. I don't want to do this. And and so that, that terms of crisis and getting help during that period of time, I was still able to move through seminary at a little bit different pace and whatnot, but it still worked. But interestingly, that was in the late it was right around 2000 when that had 2000, yeah, when it happened, the fall, and the way we the team, kind of the medical group and advisors at seminary, we handled it as something private, something that happened, something we weren't going to share back to our, my bishop that was overseeing my transition, because we figured, well, if we told them, they would say, okay, you shouldn't be a priest, you shouldn't go forward, and or there would be grave concerns, and people on the ground were like, nope, this is just in part a mental health issue that I was then dealing with, and it didn't become that, but in the impact of that, that impact of that morning, of that really, frankly, a very short period of time, and there was a build up to it, to the crisis, and then what happened, it has shifted my life dramatically in terms of my work, and in such that yeah, no, mental health and suicide prevention, the examining suicide crisis is all a part of who I am and what I do, and so that's a part of this, that my story that we share. I wonder. And I'll set aside right now kind of how I brought AFSP into my life, but I was at a fundraiser for the AFSP, and it had ended, and I don't know whether it was in Boston, and I can't remember if it was the first time I went or the second time I went, but there was a moment at that time just after we finished, and it was in the clubhouse at the Red Sox clubhouse in the Fenway Park, and my wife and I are leaving, and I recalled turning to her, and she was with me when I went through this crisis, and a wonderful partner for me. And I turned to her and I said, it just kind of came out of my mouth. I said, I'm glad I didn't end my life. And what was interesting is that it took a long time for me to get to that place. Maybe 10 years of where I really sat back and said, you know what? It's been hard. The work I've done is hard, but I came to a place that said, no, life is valuable, and if I can help others see that value, then that's wonderful. But it is something that shapes you, and for me, it challenged me in ways that were really significant. So I thank you for kind of sharing your journey, how you got to AFSP, because it is remarkable as an organization. Just by its presence is remarkable, and then kind of reflecting in some ways back over 25 years of where we've come in terms of dealing with suicide as a societal issue. And we're better, but not everything is perfect. It's better, but we still face the challenge of the impact of suicide. And so
Yeah.
what would you spend a minute, as chief medical officer for AFSP? Would you spend, what is that? What does that day look like? What does that work look like? I mean, what do you focus on as as your position, and how that works?
Yeah. Gosh, thank you for sharing what you just did, because as many times as I've, spoken to you and heard your story, it kind of just, I hear slightly different nuances and strikes me different each time. And I am struck overall by the relevance of how critical it is that when we start opening up, it's the start of everything changing and healing and fulfilling what can be your sort of potential in making meaning out of the suffering or a loss. And what I'll get to the brass tacks of what I do, but what is behind all of it really is this sense that even though the public health progress in reducing stigma and investing in science and so forth is happening, we still need a lot more, but it has started, at least in the United States, that there are still millions of people out there whose lives haven't connected with those points of progress and change yet, who are still keeping their either suicidal experience or their loss experiences kind of locked up in a compartment somewhere, thinking that if I just don't have to think about it or share it, it will be like I can just move on. And that could not be further from the truth. It may work. People may need to do that for a while for various reasons, but kind of like you described, that at a certain point, those experiences and emotions are knocking on the door to come out and manifest in various different ways in the body, in our mental health, in our relationships, in our substance use, our diet, all kinds of ways that past trauma or emotions just are going to find a way to express. So the bottling up and the keeping secrets generally it's a really fascinating topic on its own, that as a dean in the medical school, believe it or not, my team and I had identified that medical students who were having to live with secrets that they had shared with us in confidence, LGBTQ students, for example, was one more common presentation of this. The secret keeping itself created layers of risk for those students, academically, mental health, relationally, with their families. So anyway, it's just, I think those of us and those of you who are listening out there who have been able to be more open in even the smallest of ways, that's the start of this integration that can happen, that I really believe is part of the ability to become more self-reflective and honest and making choices for your life, whether it's spiritually or whether it's, related to health issues or family issues, where you can start making decisions more clearly with a clear mind and looking at all of the factors and pros and cons at play, instead of, our brains just can use denial and minimization a whole lot without, if we're not really actually working on things. It's kind of wild how that works. But my day-to-day, so as a chief medical officer at a national nonprofit organization, I oversee the mission areas of the way AFSP tries to attack the problem of suicide is through research, through a public health approach that's about educating the public, and then different layers of key people who are in the population who are more likely to be in a position to help somebody who is becoming at risk of suicide, or those who have lost loved ones to suicide. Suicide loss remains like a core community and pillar among our lived experience and really the DNA of FSP. So research, programs. We now have an impact measurement team that's relatively new at AFSP. We've grown that over the last 5 to 6 years. And that's a group of 4 PhDs who measure everything we do and the impact of our programs, our Out of the Darkness walks, our ad campaigns that we put on, like Seize the Awkward and Talk Away the Dark. Those are all things you can look up if you want to see, what does an ad campaign look like that's about suicide prevention or about talking to a peer. I also do, we also have a health equity line of work, and it's a lens that we're trying to adopt throughout all of the work of AFSP. And really what health equity means is any experience that humans have that create differences and unequal access, whether it's to education, mental health services, healthy relationships, physical health care, all of those things can actually increase suicide risk for people and key populations. So I'm very proud to say, have really developed a full portfolio and a way of thinking about our research, for example, or our program work, for example, the work in the chapters. They're actively trying to establish relationships with communities that have otherwise not felt that suicide is really relevant to them, or that an organization like AFSP would have an interest in partnering with them. So those are all things that are kind of in progress. And then our work at AFSP takes us into all kinds of really incredible spaces with partnerships with journalists and entertainment, content creators and platforms, policymakers, of course, because we have our very strong policy team. I don't oversee policy, but I work closely with them because everything they do comes out of the evidence and the research. So those are kind of my portfolio areas, and our chapter network, I think, keeps it real for us in the sense that it's one thing to fund the research and translate this evidence into the key sort of ABCs. What do we want everyone to know about suicide risk and prevention and supporting loss survivors? It's another thing to live it in your day-to-day life, in your home, with your family, or with friends who are going through these things actively in real time. And that sort of translation gap between, you could say, any area of science and how we apply it into everyday ways in our lives, but also, science around cancer and heart disease involves the development of new treatments once those issues are more understood on a cellular or molecular level. And the same type of effort is going on with regard to suicide prevention. So when you were telling your story, one frame I always have in the back of my head is what we know from science, a lot of things, but at the end of the day, we can say one thing really clearly that sums a lot of it up, which is that it's a complex health issue. And so when you were talking about how what you went through and the way it stayed in a certain space and wasn't relayed to others, which might be consistent with if you had, let's say, a serious physical health event or issue. Let's say let's say you developed cancer or you developed epilepsy and you had to deal with that health issue. And those around you at the seminary were supportive with you doing that. And together you might have made a choice that the information didn't need to be communicated. So in that health framework, we can make choices, but I think where stigma still is exerting its influence is where then there are assumptions about weakness or cowardice or character problems or even spiritual problems that those, in my mind, at least from a scientific lens on suicide, they don't actually make sense to think of suicide in those ways anymore.
Well, that's really interesting. So I think it's a number of things that have come up. I think of, if we look at, if somebody's saying, well, okay, you've described your work, what would be an example? I think our time, I know we went to, was it Columbia, Georgia, or South Carolina? I can't quite remember. It was a long time ago now.
Oh yeah,
right. To evaluate
you helped us with that.
A training program.
Yes.
And
Soul Shock.
we kind of went and watched and kind of reflected and learned and decided, is this a helpful program or not for clergy? And it was and is. And to see where, and certainly my thinking has gone from those point of views to, and the development of the wider thinking because of the evidence that has come up with, around your work and your team's work and the researchers that you all fund, their work has really kind of shifted things.
Well, you brought some of that education into faith communities and into your own
Mhm.
world of I'll never forget those experiences of being with a diocese. I forget how
Yeah,
I know
yeah,
it's all
yeah,
very
yeah,
organized, your
yeah.
world, but and even at the national level, coming to your convention, I mean, those are really
Mhm.
big pivotal sea changes in terms of how an entire community that has been based around certain theological implications, that
Mhm.
old way of viewing suicide as a sin or even unforgivable sin, and that framework, and trying to help the reframe happen based on science, and you know to bring that into a faith and a religious environment, I think is just absolutely incredible.
Yeah, thank you. I recall kind of looking through historically at how the church has looked at, and that capital C church, through the centuries of suicide, and understanding that really maybe until about the 1500s, the best they could do for suicide prevention was saying, okay, if you end your life, we're going to bury you outside the church. We're going to cast this such an awful result on you that maybe you won't do it. And that was,
Yeah.
the kind of the
Shame
assumption.
faith.
Yeah, was we're going to maybe if you feel that pressure, you will walk away from or decide to live versus to end your life. And it really wasn't until the time of John Donne, who was the English poet and clergyman, who from all aspects, certain seen from his reading his poetry, seemed to have suffered from suicidal ideation himself at times, and probably another diagnosable mental illness, where the church began the slow process of discovering kindness toward suicide and suicidal ideation. That we began that slow walk of saying, no, this is just a result of a brain that's hurting, like a broken bone, than it is from some sort of sin, and
Yeah.
no longer should it be seen that way. And certainly that challenge, or that has that work has taken a lot of generations to be able to where we are now. And I think it's, when you said that over the course of 10 years you had lost a certain number of people within that medical system. And we have it's, of course, it's quiet, but we lose clergy every now and then to suicide as well. And the mental health of clergy is something that we're still fully coming to understand. It's there's such an understanding in the field, a presumption that somebody who's leading a church or an ordained life must have their mental health house in order to be able to do that. And then we're so aghast when they make mistakes and do things that really hurt people. And of course, they're on the church side, if it's risen to that level of hurt, that we remove or discipline the clergy. But they're just humans as everybody else. So I guess what I'm saying is it's a process still that we're not that we haven't that there's kind of a locked box that we haven't been able to fully open it, to understand the factors, how the factors all come together in one single moment, the multiple factors and complexities of suicidal crisis that come together to bring someone to the brink of ending their own life and to do that. And so I think you've acknowledged some of that the research is we're getting better, but it hasn't. We don't have a simple cure.
And even with the treatments like safety planning and cognitive behavioral therapy and some new medications and TMS, transcranial magnetic stimulation, like there are really significant advances. But like I would say, like other complex health outcomes, where treatments help reduce suffering, help reduce mortality, suicide is complex. And so the work just needs to continue. And I think also for clinicians and also for clergy who are supporting people, there shouldn't be an expectation that by providing love, support, unconditional love, treatment, access to everything that's good and evidence-based, that is a guarantee that they won't die by suicide, because that would be incorrect in thinking that way. But that's hard for people who are, for a variety of reasons, to understand that cognitively, but then to apply it in our actual work with people. I want to dig into one thing that you said in that really eloquent kind of historical view of the church and the viewpoint on mental health and suicide. And it was when you talked about clergy and their own mental health and then mistakes being made. And I wonder if you are linking mistakes that happen to, obviously, there's a decision-making process in the brain, and so it does relate to the brain in that sense. But just to say one thing, in the medical literature around physician mental health and medical errors, what is found is that everyone makes medical errors because physicians are human.
Right.
And the likelihood that a physician will make an error goes up when they are experiencing burnout.
Yeah.
Not actually, the literature has not supported that depression is linked to a higher likelihood of medical errors, which is very interesting. It's also the fact that after an error occurs, or a perceived medical error, then the mental health ramifications of that can be really significant on the physician. But we also go out of our way to try to de-link, for example, this idea that everyone who is committing like mass shootings out there, that it's always derived from mental illness, or even just violence in general. Because violence in general, the analysis shows that only 4% of instances are linked to mental illness. So anyway, I wanted to just ask more about what you meant.
Yeah, I certainly would say my understanding of looking at the clergy, and just as to acknowledge this, is that we haven't done the study work on clergy mental health. I mean, I think it's there, but we haven't done real qualitative, peer-reviewed study to say, well, what is this happening? We kind of acknowledge it, and so with that, having made that statement, my conjecture, my lived experience would say that clergy burnout is certainly certainly a factor in clergy making errors that hurt congregants. And what I mean, and it's interesting that they make decisions that aren't necessarily in the best interest of the congregation. So when we have clergy that are burned out, maybe they overuse alcohol or even drugs, and then therefore in that moment, and it may not be, it's everything from they may be under the influence and have hurt someone. We know of cases of that, and even wound up killing killing by driving, committing a DUI. So we have that,
Wow.
to just knowing for a congregation, just to know that the clergy are um, uh, under the influence of alcohol or can't, is at that point of abusing substances, that even that in and of itself has an impact on the congregation, though it can hurt people because they themselves may be in recovery and see a religious leader making errors based or um, not holding themselves to a call it a sober serious life, that that has an impact. So it's actually pretty wide range. It doesn't necessarily mean um, the burnout can lead to all sorts of bad outcomes when it's church leadership, um, because it's the work of the church is so highly relational. It's so people driven that people are very involved in other people's lives, and so the impact of that can be the impact of trauma can be the result of a passive action on the result of the leader. Not directly trying to harm somebody, but just uh, by that they are burned out, and need time to recover from that, can affect congregants poorly because it reshapes their understanding. Like this person shouldn't have an issue. I remember after one of my parents died, I stepped away from a church, and there was a conversation that one person had with my wife saying, I never thought of the priest's personal life and the impact that would have. So it's a very
Yeah.
unfair
Yeah.
expectation to have that versus a clergy sexually abusing children, sexually abusing adults, clergy embezzling money, clergy being abusive verbally or physically to congregants, making poor decisions on behalf of a congregation or speaking out poorly. Those are kind of like, okay, those are active. I would put those in an active category of harm.
Yeah.
But there's this other, what might be a passive harm that church leaders have no intention of doing. They're just living their lives, and yet because of the expectations on the leadership of a religious leader, it has harm to a community. It can harm a community greatly. So I think I've moved away. I feel like I've moved away from your
No,
question, but I
no.
think
I think that was all that makes so much sense in how you framed so much of a religious leader's work is relationally based. And I think about the impact on relationships of a loved one with a mental illness. And it does not occur in a vacuum. It affects the relationship. It affects the mental health of the other family members and partners. So in that sense, yes, I can really see it's a very different frame on, my usual kind of vigilance around always assuming that occupational impairment is stemming from mental illness, which of course impairment can come from so many different health issues, physical health included, or just bad decision making that isn't linked to depression or PTSD or psychosis or even substance abuse. So anyway, yeah, and here, and this is very technical, but in my world of research and especially like academic psychiatry, the way we view burnout is like it's a very significant and important, really common occupational syndrome that that anyone can be prone to. Like literally, you don't have to have a certain genetic loading to become burned out. And so phenomenologically, we actually see it as kind of categorically different than, say, major depression, bipolar disorder, addiction, where not everyone will have the propensity towards those illnesses because they are multifaceted in terms of biology, psychology, early upbringing, genetics, all those things. And burnout may have some of that too, but we just don't view it as a clinical syndrome or illness.
Yeah,
like those
I
others.
understand the distinction, and I would say, burnout. Burnout can be from overwork for a clergy person. It could also, but
Yes.
difficult actions can also happen because of loneliness or isolation. A pastor these days, working in a small town or in a small church can spend most of their time alone and isolated, and only on on the religion, the Sunday for Christians are they really engaged, and then the rest of the time it's a can be a lonely job, and they may not understand, they may not realize how alone they are with lacking of community, because they're just moving through things. And then when they are engaged, it's only in difficult times, somebody dying, somebody sick, that kind of thing. So there's and of course that's not clinical, what they're going through, but it can lead to unfortunate actions or bad actions. It can lead to a sense of despair that is not in a sense spiritual, yes, but not driven from that, but driven from just the characteristics of the work. It can be very quiet and not intentionally, but it just is. And particularly in the modern life where people are drive to church as opposed to interact at the church, and because it's the center of town, and that kind of thing. So it really has it has a different function, a different feature, and I think some of that can lead to burnout per se, or burnout styled systems. And then there are other churches that are incredibly busy, and the pressure on the clergy is incredibly great, that would show characteristics of a very typical burnout. And the decision making could be, or the results of the decisions of both instances could be the same, which is tragic in some ways. Yeah,
I can see that. I mean, a big aspect of burnout in the medical community is the development or worsening of cynicism. And that's a very bad experience and trait to have going on in your head and in your being when you went into your profession to help and to heal.
right.
And then to start becoming jaded and, suspicious of people who are walking through the door in your ER and drug seeking and this and that. And there's a lot of that jadedness that becomes almost then like institutionalized in the culture, because that experience becomes a shared experience. So it's, I'm glad we got onto this topic. I'm not sure that it was part of your plan. But.
Yeah. Well, no, but that's the way it's supposed to go, right? We know each other well enough to say, okay, here, let's explore this. And I think from my side of kind of having that opportunity, I kind of advocate to say, here's let's take a look behind the curtain of a certain profession and see what the challenges are of that. I mean, there's obviously kind of a performance pressure of the being on a Sunday or a Saturday or a Friday, whatever the day that the congregation gathers, the community gathers, that you're expected to be the leader and you're on, and then there's this kind of what happens the rest of the week, and the balancing of those two. Many people don't see what the other hours are like, and listen, for many of the clergy, it's wonderful. It's exactly what they want. They're extroverted enough to be thrilled about a Sunday, and then need the rest of the week to recover. In some ways, and so that's part. That's it's helpful, I think, for me to have an opportunity to speak about that, and also, for you to speak about it, and particularly since the TV show The Pit has been out, and I think I'm having watched it, and I listened to what you're talking about burnout, and what one of the main characters was going through. That actor's portrayal is actually based on what actually happened. What actually can happen.
Well, if you think about, I mean, really getting to more of a meta kind of sociological viewpoint on this, if you look across occupations and industries, and if there is data and you have that opportunity to look at, the CDC does publish the data about suicide rates among different occupations and industries. And so we have an incredible, wonderful initiative going on funded by Bechtel in the construction industry at large, because they're ranked the second highest suicide rate. So that's special, and their culture is moving and changing. In the field of medicine and healthcare more broadly, like The Pit is a great example of the level of research and kind of lived experience and advocacy that's going on, even to the point that the first federal legislation, the Dr. Lorna Breen Healthcare Provider Protection Act, passed a few years ago. And so there's this acknowledgement. What that means is, first responders and healthcare providers who are frontline, there's an acknowledgement that it affects their human experience, their health, their mental health, burnout, even suicide risk. And kind of what I hear you saying, and at least the effect it's having on me, is that not all industries have had that opportunity for either the scientific or the advocacy sort of progress. It sounds like some, for sure, is happening in your occupation. But that, what I think, if I can just say it, because when I think about you and the journey you went on, and how for a time it wasn't a given and it wasn't easy to start talking more openly about your own mental health and suicide related experiences. And I remember the first time you spoke from your pulpit, incorporating that lived experience, and how powerful that is for not just for you, but the entire community and more broadly, and how that ripple effect is just, it's so powerful. It is one of the things that in my work in suicide prevention gives me the most hope about how we're so wired for social, in a way, social contagion in a good way, that when one person takes a stand like that and opens up and becomes that authentic, it really is eye-opening for many, and if not permission giving, because everyone's on their own journey of having faced some challenges in the least. It depends on what the nature, the severity, but life is that way, right? No one is without challenges. And so I think to model that, to me, that is really the ultimate high calling of role modeling and leadership, is to be able to reach that point of authenticity that gets incorporated and makes your professional work and demeanor and impact all the more beneficial and powerful. That is the way I see it. It's such a sea change from the old way in medicine, where you just had to keep it to yourself.
Right.
And that was really, I think, actually led to higher suicide rates, because of course you don't get treatment or support when you're keeping it to yourself.
Right. Okay, well, this has been grea conversation. Thank you. So, but I do want to.
Oh, I know. We could just go
Yeah,
on.
yeah, and that's okay. I think. But I want to kind of bring us around back to courage, and I think you're in a unique vantage point to speak about courage and what that means, and where do you see it? So I'd love to have your thoughts on that.
Oh, well, I mean, we've just been talking about making the decision about how much we disclose and in what environments and to
Mhm.
whom. And, I think that's where courage shows up is in a way, then it means that you're making decisions based on not so much out of your own needs, because I'm always cognizant of that, using self-disclosure in various situations, that it has to be about a bigger picture of, well, how does it add value? Um, you know,
Right.
it certainly can add value by healing for myself and others. But um, so, yeah, courage, I think also we're all wired with certain instinctual patterns and ways. And so, in some
Mhm.
small but significant ways, it's when you choose to look at what your natural instinct would be and ask yourself, is that really best suited for this moment, whatever it is in my marriage or at work with my colleague? Or am I just kind of doing it because I'm so stressed and busy that I can't take the time? But I do think it takes some courage to actually be willing to take a look at, and rather than being married to, this is just how I do things. It's just how it has to be. Um,
Right.
so I don't know.
So in a way, it's that self-examination, self-awareness,
Yeah.
willing to look inside, to see how you are, who you are, and
Yes.
discover that.
I think it takes an incredible amount of humility, which to me is linked up with courage and
Mhm.
confidence, as paradoxical as that may sound, to really be that kind of authentic and apply. It's hard to change. It's hard to look at our own foibles and flaws, and we all have them. But I think, I'm a big proponent of, as a leader or as a parent in a family dynamic, to promote the view of um, kind of the growth mindset
Mm.
that is about learning from our mistakes, that mistakes will happen. We all make them. We can try to avoid them. Certainly, that's a good thing to do. But to overload with shame and embarrassment means we might thwart the opportunity to actually learn from it and grow. And so I think if we teach our kids, or our congregants, and I don't know how this fits with sin and spirituality as
Yeah.
much, but that mistakes will happen, and that it's really what we do in response that matters more than the mistakes are just kind of going to be a given. And I suppose that we could say the same thing for sin in a way.
Hmm. Yeah, no, certainly we could, and why I think in the Christian pattern of forgiveness of sins and the centrality of forgiveness on a can be on a daily or weekly basis of somebody, whether it's the basic prayers of Christianity asking forgiveness and those that seeking of that is central, essential to the certainly to the Christian experience on that. So yeah, no, I would say that there's an acknowledgement in a way that may make many people uncomfortable to say, yeah, no, we make mistakes that separate us from God or separate us from other people, and yet and I think there's many who would say, well, I don't live my life that way. I don't harm other people. And yet, or I don't really do anything that's sinful of whatever's understanding of that is. Um, and so I don't need that. However, if we look at it as a matter of kind of through our daily life that we can harm ourselves or harm others in even minor ways, seeking that kind of clean slate to go out and improve oneself and to self-reflect and say, yeah, I can still be a better person, then that's the focus of it. It's not meant to be, I don't think, at least my understanding of sin is to be, yeah, there are we might want to say grave sins. Sure, there are things that happen that are very traumatic actions, right? But then on a daily basis, but there's still other actions that can separate us out, and forgiveness is a way of reconciling, joining the community in a healthy way. So I do think it has its help there. So I guess the last question I'd love and topic I'd love to get to today is and in particular it's because of some of the readings I've done lately, so it's on my mind. But would you speak about, if you will, I would call it a spiritual journey, but maybe just a journey for those who have lost someone to suicide? That what I've seen through my interactions with AFSP is that's a particular there's a particularness to the grief of suicide, of having someone in one's family or one's orbit die by suicide versus somebody who has been in a suicidal crisis themselves. It seems to be, it's almost the grief is particularly difficult for a parent losing a child, or a sibling losing a sibling, or a friend losing a friend. There's a the underlying, well, why did they make that choice? Somebody who's faced suicidal crisis would say, well, I know exactly why. I know what that choice was, because it's a feeling. It's a desolation, isolation, a crisis, an overwhelming flood into my system that is it can't handle it in that sense, and why the breaking goes on of it. And then the path toward anyone's life is clearer in one's mindset. But the losing of someone, and the being left with it's almost a grief of the unknown, of the grief of emptiness, that it is so hard to reconcile. That's just my observation. You're much closer to it with your work. Would you speak about that? Because I think it's important.
Yeah, I love the way you're kind of framing it up through the lens of like the spiritual journey through both of those circumstances. I will say that because the sort of literacy around mental health, and in particular suicide, is still to this day pretty low in the general population, that even for people who survive a suicide attempt, they don't always have a framework or a language,
Right.
or a conceptual way to even understand why or what just happened. They may be able to bring up some of their experiences, but lack an overarching sort of framework that, honestly, a therapist, that's one of the purposes, is to help them reflect on what happened, why it happened, and to learn from your own patterns. And then you can make choices to construct, behavior, thought, mood, patterns that can actually be preventive for future, reduce the risk of future suicidal crisis.
I may be being unfair after 25 years post of
that you've had
spending lots of time
to
reflecting on it. So I have a clear sense.
Yeah.
So yeah, thank you for that.
Yeah, no, it's all good. Because some people are very aware right away, and
Yeah.
it's there's obviously variability of people's experiences around everything, including suicidal behavior and attempts. And I think the topic around losing a loved one to suicide is a really important topic. It's something that's much more commonplace than people realize because it was shrouded in such shame and silence in the past, and still to this day. I think, if you're a neighbor of somebody who has lost someone in their family to suicide, know that in general, it's preferred to the family and the lost surviving individuals to come around like you would after the loss of someone, a loved one, to any kind of death.
Mm-hmm.
And the more we can kind of take the stigma and shame out of it, the better, in terms of an understanding for this large population of people. There are 50,000 individuals who die by suicide every year. That
Mm-hmm.
leaves, some research shows an average of 106 or 7 people who are very deeply touched by that loss. So that population grows over a lifetime. To be a fairly, by our Harris poll measurements, it's about 60% of American adults who say they've been touched personally in one way or another by suicide. It could be loss, or it could be one's own lived experience, or supporting a loved one through struggles. But I do think it's oftentimes, even if you know that the person was struggling, even if they'd had, treatment for mental illness or a previous suicide attempt, it still is experienced in a way that is just blindsiding and sheer traumatic and shock and loss. And then the journey of trying to understand why it happened can be a very vexing, like you said, that sense of uncertainty and lack of closure can be part of that. We could call it both psychological and spiritual journey of that. We hope that people find steps to take to, not that it's linear by any means, but to progress and not to sort of stagnate or get stuck in a period of what we could call complex or complicated or prolonged grief, which actually is has treatment that can help it, because about 30% of suicide loss survivors may get in this sort of stuck phase where the yearning for the loved one is so intense that it actually interferes with their relationship with those in their life, right. Or their work, or their sense of being able to experience joy or themselves as a full human. So we don't think of suicide loss and bereavement or grief as having kind of an endpoint. We think of the goal as integration with their overall life, purpose, worldview, their spiritual journey. I mean, obviously, spiritual faith can be an enormously grounding part of healing, because I think it probably many things, including the spiritual realities themselves, but the belief that there is something deeper and greater that I may not be able to understand in this moment, and to have that at least momentary acceptance that can be grounded in spiritual faith can be enormously helpful in this pretty arduous process of healing after suicide loss. And I think it's not a given that people will go on that journey. They may find their own way, right. But so many families kept it a secret, and then it just kind of stayed unresolved and in a way stuck. And there is some research around, for example, spouses who have lost their spouse to suicide, that the physical health and the mental health ramifications of, in medicine, we call it the sequelae of that traumatic loss, can be very intense in terms of higher incidence of not only suicidal ideation, but dying by suicide and other physical health outcomes that put them at greater risk. So the healing is really critically important. And we have at AFSP a whole community of people and trained loss survivors who will meet with someone who's newly bereaved to just connect and offer up community and, a sense of of what their future can be, because it can be so overwhelming, especially in the early phase after suicide loss.
Wow. Wow. Well, I think, again, we could go on for another hour or two. I
I
think
think we could.
have thoroughly have enjoyed our time to be able to really dive into this and think about it and discuss it. So, again, I am grateful for the time you've spent with us and so much, and really appreciative of all of that. So, yeah,
Thank
we're
you.
gonna.
I'm so grateful for you and your platform, and just how you've really brought all of this out into the open in a way that I'm sure is making healing and connecting for so many others more readily
Yeah.
available.
Great. And so, if just to always plug it, because we're here. I remember the year that we were working federally to see and we had caught the wave of getting the bill through. But the suicide prevention hotline, what number is that people can call?
Yeah, right. 988 is
988.
available 24/7. And to learn more about how to get involved with suicide prevention or healing after loss, you can go to afsp.org.
Well, Christine, thank you so much for your time today.
Bob.
Let's bring it back over to Hope. Will you wrap this up, Hope, please?
Wow, that was beautiful and just profound. Thank you both. I'm so excited to be able to produce this and meet these wonderful people that you bring onto your show. So this is Courage to Thrive on the Incandescent Radio Network and Incandescent TV, Spotify, iHeart, and Apple. Christine, that was so amazing, your journey and your honesty, both of you. So thank you for sharing. I'm sure this is going to touch a lot of people. So you said dial 988. If in an emergency. Okay, we will promote that. May is Mental Health Awareness Month. So hug your loved ones and check in. All right, y'all. We will see you next month on the Courage to Thrive show. I'm Hope Katz-Gibbs, proud producer, and we will talk to y'all soon. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you so much.